Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this fourth out of five clips that I cut from an interview that I conducted with former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, William B. Taylor. I conducted the interview with him online on July 14th. Again, this is the fourth out of five clips from that interview, and this is probably my favorite out of the five because it deals with journalism in conflict. As most of you know, I've covered a lot of conflict from Central America to the Middle East over the years, and it's really close to my heart. The subject is close to my heart. As always, never hesitate to reach out if you have questions, comments, or concerns. I'm available at billgentile@billgentile.com. Okay, I'll see you after this clip is over.
So let's move on to the third component of our discussion, and that is, what role should journalism play in time of war? And again, we're going to take a little trip back to my memoir here for a short read of a couple of paragraphs about my experience, covering these wars in Central America. Like many of the journalists working in Nicaragua at the time, I felt that our work was more a humanitarian mission than a job. We gave voice to the poor working class, the peasants, the laborers, whose voices would never be heard in their own country, and certainly not beyond the borders of their country, had it not been for us, the international media. With passion and empathy, we told their stories and revealed to the world their misery in the hope that outside forces could help change their lives for the better. You will find journalists today who scoff at this notion that our craft is something more than a job. They will tell you that those who practice it with altruistic passion, even reverence, are soft-hearted idealists whose judgment may be skewed by emotion and therefore are not to be trusted. Don't believe them. Journalism is more than a craft. It's a calling. It's a manner in which one engages life. This is what I believe. This is what I practice. This is what I teach. So, Mr. Ambassador, let's look at some of the stories being told by journalists in Ukraine today. If, in fact, Ukraine's battle against Russia is a just war, as you define it, and I believe it, should Western media report on atrocities committed by Ukrainian soldiers as well as Russian soldiers? The issue here, I think, is, would disclosures of Ukraine abuses not undermine Ukraine's chances for victory and what we believe is a just war?
I don't think so, Bill. I don't think so. For the reason that you and I hinted at before in the earlier part of this discussion, that is, if there are violations, if there are human rights violations, if there are atrocities committed, and if the Ukrainians do what I think they are ready to do and will do, if they identify them themselves, if their authorities, if their chain of command identifies it and brings those violators, Ukrainian soldiers, to justice, that will demonstrate to the world that this is a real democracy, that this is a democracy that values the rule of law, that this is a democracy that has a military that abides by the military ethos. So I think the answer to your first question is yes, of course, journalists should report on all of what they see. Journalists are there. I'm reminded, Bill, of the dedication. You've probably read this book too, but just for all the people watching, there's a great book written by a historian at Yale, Timothy Snyder, who wrote a lot of books about this, about East Europe and Ukraine. Is The Road to Unfreedom is the title of it. And the dedication is, I think the words are, it's close to these words, for the journalists, the heroes of our time. And he says that because in his book, The Road to Unfreedom, he describes misinformation and disinformation and propaganda and lies that come from lots of places. He was focused on Russia. I would focus on Russia, but he makes the point that that the journalists are the ones to help identify the truth. And it's only by looking at the story, whatever the story is, from different angles and different reports, and different ways to justify it and rectify it and correct it and dig a little deeper into. The journalists do that. So in his view, the journalists were the heroes of our time. They are going to save us from the lies that he thought was taking us or could take us to unfreedom, the road to unfreedom. So it's very inspiring.
Yeah, I got to tell you, you're preaching to the choir here. I can't tell you how many times that I tell my students, we, the journalists, we're part of the last line of defense of our democracy in this country. We're on the front lines of this whole battle for truth. Yeah. And, we've got politicians now who will get up in front of, national television cameras, and they'll lie straight to the face of every American in the country, And
you can't let them get away with it. And journalists are there. No. Journalists are there. So, Bill, one other thing that I wanted to, on the part of the book that you read about journalism being a humanitarian mission, not a job. I thought that was a really important point. And again, some of the overlap between what you do and what I have done and what my friends and colleagues and Army buddies do as well is we are also on a mission, not a humanitarian mission, clearly, but we're on a mission, a national security mission. We believe that the work that being in the military, that defending the United States is a defense of the American people, and we're there at our government's direction, and we are there on a mission. It is not a job. It's just exactly what you say. It is a mission. It's a national security mission that we're there. Now, that's not to say that that the U.S. government never makes mistakes. We know it makes mistakes. We know it makes mistakes. There's no doubt about that. But by and large, we try. When you go in the military, you swear to defend the Constitution,
right?
Enemies, foreign and domestic, and that if that Constitution holds and that constitutional order resides in the president and the Secretary of Defense and your chain of command, and they tell you this is your mission, then you do it. A great mentor of mine in a different context said, if your country asks you to do something, you do it. It's going to be effective. And so it is a mission. It's not a job.
Let's get back to Ukraine here for a second. The New York Times published a story last week from the eastern city of Sloviansk. It addressed the effectiveness of Russian propaganda and the deep divisions in that part of the country. The campaign has been so effective that it's convinced some Ukrainians still in the city that the missiles that have landed in their city were actually fired by Ukrainian forces and not by Russian forces. The mayor of that city responded to the Russian propaganda by saying, quote, "Everyone sees what they want. They want to believe it." Close quote. So how do those of us who believe in facts, in verifiable truths, in accountability, and in science push back against propaganda, unsubstantiated claims, and outright lies? How do we do that?
Facts. It has to be facts. It has to, and what are the facts? The facts are what the journalists dig up, find out, investigate, and they go to where they need to go to find out this. We can determine where missiles come from. You can do analysis of a crater, of a bomb crater, and you can tell in which direction the missile or the artillery round or the cruise missile, you can tell where it came from. Just on that example. And that's why the mayor's exactly right. It's certainly possible, and we know who's firing at Sloviansk. It's the next city It's in the next oblast after Luhansk. It's in Donetsk. And Donetsk is the next oblast that the Russians want. The Russians tried to get Kyiv. They tried to come down from the north and take over the capital of the country, Kyiv, and they were frustrated. They were defeated. They were pushed back into Russia. So they came around and they narrowed their aims. They didn't want to take the whole country again, they said. They may still want to do that. But they went all the way around and they came in from the east and they first took Luhansk and now they're after Donetsk. And so we know the direction of the artillery. And if it turns out that the journalists look at that crater in Sloviansk and they say, oh no, it's actually coming from the west, we'll know it's fired by the Ukrainians. However, if it's coming from the east and the northeast, we know where it's coming from. So the mayor's right.
Yeah, the mayor may be right in this case, but I couldn't help, while I was reading this piece, I couldn't help thinking about some of the people in our country who watched, for example, what happened on January 6th and come away with a completely different version of what actually happened. I mean, okay, this is right in front of your eyes. You're seeing what actually happened. Don't you believe now? And they won't. So
some will, Bill. Some will.
I hope.
Some will. There's no doubt in my mind. There's no doubt in my mind that people will see and they'll believe their own eyes. They'll believe their own eyes.
There was another story in the New York Times. I'm a big fan of the New York Times, possibly because I know so many people who work in it, and they're really smart, good, hardworking people. And this story was about Western volunteers who have gone to Ukraine to fight alongside the Ukrainians, against the Russian invasion. And the last sentence of this piece, I'll read it to you. Quote, open quote, Matthew Robinson, a Briton who is a former US military contractor in Iraq, said he saw his service in Ukraine as a form of redemption for having profited from a war he now believes was unjust. And this just struck a chord with me. As I read the piece, I couldn't help but wonder whether the West's overwhelmingly enthusiastic support for Ukraine is rooted in part in a similar quest for redemption after having supported the very morally ambiguous war in Iraq. And as a follow-up, do you see any of this quest for redemption as part of your own response to having fought in the morally ambiguous war in Vietnam?
No, that's an easy answer. No, the war in Ukraine is peculiar, unique to Ukraine and Russia. For me, as we've talked about earlier, this unprovoked attack by the Russians on the Ukrainians, unjustified, couldn't find a justification, Putin couldn't, it's so clear what the moral justification is. And I've already talked about the strategic and the geostrategic and the importance of Ukraine winning in that regard. But the moral clarity, again, for me, is very clear. It has nothing to do with Vietnam. I served in Iraq, as you know. And I mentioned earlier, we make mistakes. The United States government makes mistakes. We made some mistakes, both in Vietnam and in Iraq. But for me, the support of Ukraine has nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with that.
Let me ask you, when did you decide that the effort in Vietnam was morally ambiguous? What was this during your work there, or was it afterwards?
Afterwards. It was very clear. It was very, very clear. So, and Bobby Seitz and I were just having this conversation today. We went there. We went to Vietnam as what? 22-year-olds, 23-year-olds. We were lieutenants. Later on, we were captains while we were there. We were there. I speak for myself, but I think others felt the same way. We were there not because we had thought through the moral implications or really even the strategic implications of the war in Vietnam. We were there out of a sense of duty. You mentioned that journalists like you, committed journalists, go toward the fight, go toward the violence. And my friends and Army buddies, we also went towards the fight. We marched marched to the sound of the guns. That's where we went to Vietnam, not out of any great understanding of the strategic implications or the moral pluses and minuses. No, we went there, as I mentioned, because our government ordered us to. We did volunteer, but ordered us to do. And we felt an obligation, a loyalty to our men, was all men at the time, to our men, to the people in our platoon, in our company, to each other. That's what we were doing. Yes, it was a mission, a military mission. We did it to the best we could. And the answer to your question is, it was not until I got back from Vietnam. I was lucky to go to helicopter flight school when I got back. And I will tell you that helicopter flight school is not intellectually demanding. And I was able to do some reading that opened my eyes to how we got into Vietnam many years earlier. You will know that it's David Halberstam's Best and the Brightest, talking about I think he's a New York Times reporter that you like so well. He wrote Best and the Brightest, and that was an interesting story about how we got into it. By the way, I got a bone to pick with the New York Times. The editorial board, about a month ago, I don't know, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, came out with what I thought was a morally questionable and strategically mistake, saying something that we talked about earlier, that, the Ukrainians are going to have to give up territory. They might, but that's not for the New York Times editorial board to say, or President Macron to say, who has said some very similar things. That's for the Ukrainian people, as evidenced by and as led by President Zelensky. That's their decision, not for the New York Times. New York Times also, by the way, just one last thing about the New York Times. They had a reporter in Russia in the 30s, and he went down into Ukraine, in the part of Russia, part of the Soviet Union. He was in Russia, he was in Moscow, but it was during Soviet times, during the 30s. And he went down into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, where there was a famine, where Joe Stalin had confiscated the food for Ukrainians and kept them from leaving. He engineered a famine that killed at least 4 million Ukrainians, starved to death. That's a horrible death.
Wow.
And this New York Times reporter went down there, said, nothing to see here. Nothing to see here. The Soviets kind of walked him around, and he did, and he came back and reported on it. He won a Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah, I read about this guy a couple of months ago, probably.
Durante.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it for clip number 4. Clip number 5 is something you probably don't want to miss, because it's a question and answer session between the public that's watching our interview online and Ambassador Taylor and myself. So I'll advise when that's coming down the pike. Until then, again, never hesitate to contact me if I can be of any help. Thanks. So long. Be safe.